The Adventures of Batman was the first ever animated Batman series, and it's definitely a product of its time, and more importantly, a product of the producers. Being as it was a Filmation show, that easily ensured janky animation, a lot of still images, the same 3 to 4 voice actors performing every role in an episode, and reused frames in animation. Oh boy, are there reused animations. Did you like this shot of Robin throwing a batarang? Or this scene with Batman and Robin driving around in the Batmobile? Well, I sure hope you did, because you'll be seeing it at least once an episode. How about this image of the Joker laughing? Well, don't worry, because you'll see it all the time, even when the character isn't supposed to be laughing. I could honestly spend the whole video just talking about this and all that was recycled, because it's pretty noticeable. Episode to episode, it's just an animation recap of something you've already seen before, but now presented with a different story behind it, which doesn't exactly make binge-watching it all that appealing. Granted, this show came out before binge-watching would ever be a concept, would ever be a thought to somebody, but if you had the memory of a goldfish, you could still tell where corners were cut. And sure, there were a lot of limitations in animation in 1968. But a lot of these issues weren't due to those limitations, they were due to cost-saving measures. It was kind of the Filmation formula at the time. But because such little attention was put into the actual animation, it led to a lot of errors. The characters are just carelessly placed over backgrounds, a lot of the time pretty poorly. Like, look at this, the perspective is all kinds of off here. You could honestly probably find an animation goof every 12 seconds. 1 minute a detail on the character's clothing will go missing, and the next Batman's eyes won't be colored in properly. These aren't exactly far and few between, there's too many to list here. But despite all of that, and actually in part because of it, I think this show has some real charm. You know, if you could get past the seizure that the opening credits put you in. I mean, really, that's kind of intense. I had to squint to watch it, and even then so, it was still pretty hard on the eyes. This show was clearly meant to be a spiritual successor to the 1966 live-action Batman series, which it very blatantly takes a lot of cues from. The show's narrator teasing cliffhangers, the constant bat transition in between scenes. Even the show's voice actors sound like they're doing soft impersonations of the actors from that show, with some being more blatant than others. The show wore its inspiration on its sleeve. So much so that allegedly at one point in time, an ABC logo was placed on a wall in the background of a shot to pay homage to that previous series and the channel it played on. But when this was found out by CBS, the channel on which this show aired, they made the animators take it out after the initial airing. And if that story is true, that is more effort that was put into the animation than ever before. The characters chosen to grace this small-budget, small-screen adaptation were also the characters of that original show, including original characters from that original show. You have Chief O'Hara being referenced, and characters who were drastically recreated on or because of the 66 series were also inclusions in this installment. Batgirl appears as Commissioner Gordon's daughter, as she did on that first show, and Mr. Freeze appears as Mr. Freeze, whereas previously this character had been referred to as Mr. Zero. That was a change that the 66 show made. The one major difference here is that the characters, for the most part, seem to have taken on a more closer likeness to their comic book counterparts. I mean, some of these designs don't look too dissimilar from their live-action actors at the time. Sure, the Penguin's a little shorter and fatter, but he's mostly the same guy. Mr. Freeze has got the costume from the comics, but he's still wearing the much more suiting colors of the 1960s show. Then you have characters like Commissioner Gordon, who look completely redesigned from the ground up. And characters like the Joker and Alfred, who seamlessly transition from on-page to on-screen. But you also have worst-case scenarios, like green jumpsuit Catwoman. You know the man meme that everyone seems to love? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I present you Woman. Hold the cat. There is nothing cat-like to her character outside of her moniker. And I know that this was a costume from the comics at a time, but it was a very short-lived period of time for very good reason. The episodes were comprised of 2 12-minute mini-adventures, which would see the dynamic duo take on whatever nefarious knave or fiendish foe they had to deal with that week. They're usually short, sweet, and to the point stories. And the show itself was pretty much the same thing, as it only lasted 17 episodes. In terms of voice actors, this Batman and Robin were pretty iconic in their own right. I think it's a shame that they're not brought up more often when talking about depictions of the dynamic duo. They would have a lot of longevity in these roles as well, playing the parts again in the Super Friends show and the many variations that came from it, and once again in the new Scooby-Doo adventures, both of which I believe are probably a little bit more fondly remembered than this actual show, which seems to have mostly been forgotten in spite of its historic status. Additionally, I think the Batgirl in this is well cast and well designed as well. I actually happen to really appreciate all of these classic costumes. I don't know if any of them are my favorite, but I can't help but have a fondness for each of them. Unlike the heroes, the villains on this show are mostly pretty forgettable. The show typically recycles the same 4 or 5 rogues ad nauseum. The Joker, the Penguin, the Riddler, Catwoman, Mr. Freeze. Sometimes they'll try to spice things up and team 2 of them together, but that only does so much, and they don't really leave all that much of an impression, all things considered. It definitely doesn't help matters that they're all sharing the same voice actors, and those voice actors seem like they're just doing their best to mask their own cadence and differentiate their voice, rather than finding a fitting voice for the character that they're portraying. And it's like that for the first half of the season. But then the show starts surprising you, giving audiences the first on-screen appearances of characters like the Scarecrow, the Mad Hatter, Dollman, Simon the Pieman. We'll get into those last 2 in a second, but focusing on the first 2, it's kind of surprising to me that these villains were actually brought in during Batman's on-screen infancy. Because these are typically villains who don't get a whole lot of screen time, all things considered. There is not enough Scarecrow and Mad Hatter stories in moving media, which is really sad because these are characters that have lent to very famous and very interesting stories in the comics. Now as for the other 2 characters, the Dollman is an actual character from the comics. Except that this Dollman isn't actually an adaptation of that character, but rather a completely different character, being a reimagining of the rogue Puppet Master. And Simon the Pieman is an all-original character who is an evil chef crime boss. Sal Maroni, eat your heart out, because it's going to be served to you with a side order of pie. To make matters worse, for some reason, he also uses a Simon Says catchphrase. I don't know, I just think this guy's doing too much and none of it is good. But it's also right at home for this time period and the show that it's on. Batman villains back in the day were always odd one-note jokes that had an extended stay way past their welcome. And Simon the Pieman is no different, as this is a character who makes more than one appearance on the show. Because, I don't know, I guess people don't like learning from their mistakes. The show is absolutely insane, and on occasion, provides some very bizarre and laughable visuals. Like face masks that are used to perfectly protect someone's true identity, which surprisingly would be an element of the mythos that would later go on to be used by Batman the Animated Series. I don't know, a little too goofy for my liking. One of my favorite tropes in this has to be that every Batman villain has an army of henchmen who dress in complementary costumes. I mean, that's loyalty and dedication you just can't buy. These are guys who just love their job. But it offers you sights that you might not expect in a Batman show. Like Batman whipping a lion in the middle of a city street, or an Alice in Wonderland cosplay party being ruined by DC's greatest heroes, or Mr. Freeze disguising himself as Santa Claus, or Simon the Pieman disguising himself as Mother Goose, twice, and the Bat family actually being confused by his transformation, despite the fact he used the same exact disguise with a different alias in the past. Oh, is that not enough for you? Well, that's okay, we also have radioactive cats, the Joker becoming a pirate, and this. Whatever this is, I'm not too sure. I can't go into detail about what it is that I'm seeing because I don't want to get demonetized. I can't go into detail about this that I'm seeing because I don't want to be demonetized, but it seems like something that a particular older audience would enjoy. These are just some things that might catch you off guard when going into this. There's more, believe me. The stories are as wacky as you can imagine. with Penguin trying to expose Bruce Wayne and Batman as being the same person because he found out that they share the same birthday, Robin saving a man from drowning only for that man to switch out his utility belt when he wasn't looking, the Joker becoming the mayor of Gotham City, Viking Mr. Freeze, and dolls who are made to commit crimes. All that and more happens in 17 episodes. If you're a Batman aficionado, I think you have to check the series out. It's the first of its kind. It's where the history of animated Batman starts. And I think if you're a parent and you have a child you want to show the character to, this would probably be the most age-appropriate place to start. But if you're just a casual fan, you could probably skip this. Besides, it's not like this has anything that other Batman shows haven't recreated. As a matter of fact, there was another Batman show that pretty much directly recreated this, except it did it in a much more odd and outlandish way, including even more odd and outlandish characters. The New Adventures of Batman isn't necessarily anything new. As a matter of fact, a lot of these new adventures are really just old adventures recycled, to a degree. The previous Filmation show reused a lot of the same animation in their series, often leading to a lot of mistakes and just overall editing errors. While the second series reused a lot of the same animations from the first series, it's definitely better animated overall. The character models are mostly copy and pasted from that very show, and so are their movements and mannerisms, with some exceptions and some alterations. Robin's costume is slightly altered, with the colors of his emblem being reversed. Mr. Freeze is wearing the same costume he wore in that first show, but this time he decided to leave the helmet at home, except for in the intro where he's wearing it anyway. Jim Gordon bears a resemblance to his former self from that first cartoon, but he's now drawn with added details to make him more closely resemble the Commissioner from the comics. The Penguin suit is a color lighter, and he's lost his signature cigarette due to what I suppose were probably standards and practices at the time. But like Mr. Freeze, he still carries it in the intro for some reason, though attention to detail isn't exactly something these shows excelled in. The Catwoman character is thankfully completely redesigned, which is a definite upgrade to her first look, but it still bears no resemblance to any Catwoman from the comics that I've ever seen. I think this is a costume that's unique to this series specifically. I can't say that I love it, but I definitely hate it a lot less than the first one. Additionally, her team of Catmen henchmen have now been swapped out for a team of Catwomen like herself, although they're still wearing the same exact outfit. The Riddler, for some reason, exchanged his more traditional green bodysuit for a pink one. Not that he'll get much use of it, as the character only appears in the intro to these episodes, never making an appearance in the actual episodes. He is missing in action and hiding in plain sight. The Riddler may be lost, but he isn't alone, as the villain the Scarecrow never shows up. Allegedly this was done because Hanna-Barbera owned the rights to the character, as well as Solomon Grundy, whom were all currently being used in the show The Super Friends. I just find it strange that you can make two animated series about Batman that are out at the same time, but using Solomon Grundy in more than one place at a time is going to confuse people. Like some of Batman's rogues gallery, Alfred also never makes an appearance on this show. I don't think he's ever even given a mention or referenced. I don't know if there's a reason for that, it seems kind of pointless. But for one reason or another, he's just never brought up. Another change made was to Batgirl. Not her attire necessarily, but to the character overall. She shows up here looking just as she did before, but this time around, Barbara Gordon isn't an ordinary librarian, but rather Gotham's district attorney. There were plenty of new additions to this new show, a lot of which I think are surprisingly positive. The New Adventures of Batman wasn't shy about expanding Batman's rogues gallery. Where the previous series brought audiences Simon the Pieman, this series created the likes of Sweet Tooth, Zarbor, and Professor Bubbles. I'm not kidding, those are all real names of very real villains in this real show. The Sweet Tooth is an obese bad guy with a boat. He's a Sweet Tooth with a Sweet Tooth. And he leads, I'm not kidding, once again, this is real, get this, he leads a gang of overweight children. I don't even know where to begin with that one, but I just want it to end. Professor Bubbles is an evil professor who wants to create an underwater empire. and I can only describe his voice as what happens when you speak through a fan, or when you're talking and gargling mouthwash. His evil deeds are supported by an accomplice named Flo, and using a shark named Sharktooth. The show also gave fans the likes of Electro and the Chameleon. Yeah, and once again, this is real. I'm not kidding. This is a real thing. Of course, these aren't the same Sinister 2 of Spider-Man fame, but it's just kind of weird to think that Batman has rogues that share the same name as the Webheads. Electro is an alien thief with the ability to shrink others and use mind control. There's not a whole lot more to say. Even saying that is probably a little bit too much. Before I get to you about the Chameleon, let me just state that all the villains I just listed for you are also in the intro of this show. And despite that, they otherwise only make one appearance in this series, and that's in their own episodes. They make one appearance, and that is one appearance too many. Like the Chameleon from Spider-Man comics, the Chameleon of this Batman cartoon is a shapeshifter. But rather than transform into people, he transforms into things, changing between objects and animals. Additionally, this Slender Man can stretch his limbs like he's Mr. Fantastic. Out of all of these new villains, I think this one might be most at home. I don't know if he works as a Batman villain per se, but he definitely feels like a villain out of the Silver Age. Ultimately, this character is revealed to be a robot, who's being controlled from within by the true villain, Dr. Devious. That's a villain made for this show inside another villain made for this show. I just don't see either making their big return anytime soon. This toon also marked the first appearance of Clayface in moving media. This is the first time this villain crafted his way out of a comic book. And it is not great, but it is something, so that counts. That's a positive. This Clayface is listed as being Matt Hagen, the second Clayface from the comics, but the one that for one reason or another is usually used in favor of the first Clayface, Basil Karlo. Hagen's transformations are not usually shown on screen, and when they are, well, again, it's not great. Additionally, he also changes into animals, so now the only thing that could have differentiated him from the character the Chameleon is now gone, and they serve the same purpose. But only one of these characters got to appear multiple times, so there is that. While he isn't a villain made for the show itself, obviously, this show was still the first time this villain would show himself. Another first-time villain is the character Moon Man. The Moon Man follows the traditional trope of all of this hero's friends being villains. An old astronaut friend of Bruce's becomes possessed by space waves, turning him into a golden antagonist trying to set the moon free of Earth's influence. I was actually surprised to find out that this character wasn't original to the series, but was instead a short-lived villain from the Silver Age, though in the comics he's known as Bryce Rogers, whereas here he's referred to as Scott Rogers. I imagine that was done because Bryce is a little bit too close to Bruce. This cartoon was surprisingly innovative, being the first Batman project to give the Joker a pet hyena. That's right, before Bud and Lou, before other Bruce, before Woof, there was Giggles. He doesn't do much aside from laughing along with the Joker, but he's a cute sidekick to the Clown Prince of Crime. I almost want to root for this bad guy, you know? I mean, the guy's a loving pet owner. He can't be that bad. However, the show's biggest new addition has to be its smallest new addition.
Bat-Mite.
I was shocked to see this magical imp showcased so early into Batman's on-screen run. He was pretty much brought in to be this series' Scooby-Doo, but in reality at times he can act a lot more like a Scrappy-Doo. He's the extra cartoony character in this cartoon, who completely overshadows and replaces Batgirl as being the three in this trio. Barbara barely gets any screen time here, no longer being penciled in as the dynamic duo's +1. But rather an extended member of this already extended Bat family. I think the best way I could describe him is to say that Bat-Mite is this series' Slimer. He's a cute character that can be a lot of fun when he's done right, but only if there's not too much focus being put on him. As an avid Batman the Animated Series watcher, I remember Bat-Mite's cameo in that cartoon, but I never realized that this line was actually a reference to this iteration of the character.
But, his help. Just wanna help. Just wanna help.
While Bat-Mite means well, he's usually much more of a hindrance than he is a help. But in spite of his best efforts, he can actually be of service at times. Surprisingly, I found myself really enjoying him. He's relentlessly annoying, but in a charming way. It feels much more like a fixture of the character rather than a flaw in it. I also really dig the design. It's a detour from the original design, but it still suits this little guy. He now has green skin, a Timmy Turner-like overbite, and lighter colors. It feels like a happy marriage between the character from the comics mixed with the Hanna-Barbera Filmation type of character designs. And while I personally am a fan of the character, it doesn't feel like some of his colleagues are. Even Camptastic Batman doesn't have a whole lot of affection for him, spending a whole lot of his screen time scolding his biggest fan.
Batman, you saved my life.
We all have our weak moments.
But
Don't call us, we'll call you.
you need my help to fight evil.
Three's a crowd, Bat-Mite.
He's a real pain for the dynamic duo. Speaking of that dynamic duo, as the original Batman and Robin were now wrapped up in the Super Friends saga, voicing the characters there on several incarnations that series saw, the show opted to bring in different talent. But instead of changing the cast, they made the decision to change back the cast, bringing back the iconic Adam West and Burt Ward to play the iconic Batman and Robin. There's actually something incredibly heartwarming hearing those voices come out of these character models. And it fits perfectly.
Greetings, Bat fans. This is Batman.
And Robin, the boy wonder.
The tone of that show and the tone of this are very much alike. Both were made for PG audiences, utilizing the campiest and most cartoony versions of these characters. This series was made in the same vein as that one, and I think the transition between live-action cartoon to actually animated cartoon was seamless. It makes me wonder how this show didn't last longer. It would have been really nice to see these actors reprise their roles for years to come, with new animated adventures. They'd get 2 animated movies later on, but I think I prefer this presentation. This one feels a whole lot more pure. Whereas those later films, as fun as they are, feel like they were made to capitalize on nostalgia, and wink at the audience to let them know that they're in on the joke. Again, not saying that those were bad follow-ups by any means, but again, for my money, I prefer this take. The rest of the cast from the 60s show doesn't return to their roles, with Melindy Britt taking over the role of Batgirl and Catwoman, Lou Scheimer as Bat-Mite, as well as Batcomputer and Clayface, and Winnie Line-Rip playing, well, everybody else. In terms of quantity of actors, there's very little, but in terms of quality, there's quite a lot of that. Even though there's only a handful of people working on this show, more often than not, they're putting on passable performances, with the returning Batman and Robin obviously being standouts. Though I'd argue that Bat-Mite is probably just as memorable, if not more memeable. This show is just as bizarre as the previous one was. From Clayface finding an acrobat that just so happens to look like an acrobat turned boy wonder, Catwoman stealing a machine that turns garbage into fabric, a jolly fat dude turning Gotham's water supply into syrup, the Penguin opening up a crime school, and a bizarre Clayface Catwoman team-up, this show has no shortage of strangeness. But at the top of that list has to come this season's big bad, if you can call him that. I mentioned all of the villains this show offered new and old, but I actually left one off that list. Maybe the most important one of the bunch is the made-for-series character, Zarbor, who is in fact not a villain of Batman's, but rather a villain of Bat-Mite's. A villain from the same dimension as the tiny vigilante. Zarbor puts together a team of bad guys, who almost all vaguely sound like him. This new deadly alliance consists of the likes of the Joker, the Penguin, Catwoman, and Clayface. But ultimately he turns on the team, showing that there's not only no honor amongst thieves, but there's also no friends amongst foes. What's surprising is that in spite of this series showcasing episodic adventures, the last 3 episodes are sort of an extended finale. It's the Zarbor saga, which sees maybe the most serious threat this series ever conjured up, as Bat-Mite's arch-enemy, threatens to take over the country with the aid of a brainwashed Batman and Robin. This leads to Bat-Mite and Batgirl teaming up. The two sidekicks work side by side, and the Justice Seekers manage to justify their inclusions into the show, as it's truly them that get to finally save the day at the end. And that is the New Adventures of Batman. And I actually think I found this series a little bit more endearing than the previous, even though a good portion of this show is made from the scraps of its predecessor. This was my first time watching this show, and I'm almost certain it won't be my last. I mean, I guess it can't be, because there's obviously going to be an Adam West video made in the future for sure. My point is, in spite of this being made for a younger audience, in spite of this being obviously dated, in spite of it having limitations, and being a much more family-friendly PG version of these characters and the events of the show, I think I'd watch it again strictly for my own entertainment, and I suggest you do too. Ironically enough, upon researching this show for this video, I found out that it's finally being released on Blu-ray later this month. Or later in the month in which I'm recording. I think it will be out by then. I don't know. My schedule's screwed. If it's out on Blu-ray, I highly suggest picking it up. With that being said, if you like this video and want to see a review on other Batman shows, maybe say like Batman the Brave and the Bold, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time, same bat channel.